Have you ever watched someone walk into a debate thinking they've already won, only to be completely outmatched? It's that moment when arrogance meets reality, and the person who was supposed to dominate suddenly finds themselves scrambling for answers. That's exactly what happened when a leftist professor, confident in her academic superiority, decided to challenge Donald Trump. She thought she had him figured out, a businessman with no real knowledge of history, economics, or political philosophy. In her mind, this would be easy. A public takedown, a lesson in intellectual authority, a moment that would confirm everything she had preached to her students about so-called populist leaders. But what she didn't realize was that Trump wasn't just a man with opinions. He was a man armed with experience, facts, and an ability to cut through rhetoric like a knife through butter. As the discussion unfolded, what was meant to be a moment of triumph for the professor quickly turned into something else entirely. Trump didn't just respond. He dismantled. He exposed the flaws in her arguments, turned her own logic against her, and proved, once again, why so many of his critics have learned the hard way that underestimating him is always a mistake. By the time it was over, the so-called intellectual had nothing left to say. The crowd watching had witnessed something incredible. A leader, written off by the elites, standing his ground and proving that real-world wisdom will always overpower theoretical arrogance. What exactly did he say that left the professor speechless? How did he turn the tables so effortlessly? Let's dive into the moment that no one saw coming. If you believe in leadership, power, and second chances, this is the place for you. Hit that like button, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to never miss an inspiring Trump story. From the moment Donald Trump entered the world of politics, he was met with skepticism from the academic elite. They dismissed him as nothing more than a businessman, someone who had made his fortune in real estate and branding, but lacked the intellectual capacity to engage in serious political discourse. To them, leadership required years of academic study, policy research, and adherence to ideological theories crafted within the walls of prestigious institutions. Trump, in their eyes, was an outsider who had no place in their world. Among those who held this view was a well-known leftist professor, a figure revered in academic circles for her expertise in political science and economics. She had spent decades shaping young minds, reinforcing the belief that people like Trump were nothing more than opportunists who thrived on populist rhetoric rather than real knowledge. To her, he was an anomaly, an unqualified leader whose rise to power was an unfortunate accident rather than the result of skill or strategy. She had waited for an opportunity to challenge him, to expose him as the fraud she believed he was. When that moment finally came, she was certain of the outcome. In her mind, this was not a debate. It was a lesson, an opportunity to demonstrate to the world that intelligence and expertise belonged to those who had spent their lives studying policy, not to those who had simply built businesses and won elections through sheer force of personality. With confidence bordering on arrogance, she posed her questions, carefully crafted to trip him up, to push him into unfamiliar territory where his supposed lack of depth would be revealed. She started with economic policy, throwing out complex theoretical frameworks, expecting him to stumble over the technical jargon. She moved on to history, challenging his understanding of past administrations and constitutional law, convinced that he lacked the depth to engage with the subject. Then she shifted to leadership, asking him about the principles that guided his decisions, expecting a response filled with vague statements rather than substantive analysis. She was sure that within moments he would falter. She imagined the headlines that would follow, the media celebrating her intellectual takedown of the most controversial political figure of the modern era. She envisioned her students watching, nodding in agreement as she systematically dismantled the myth of Trump's intelligence. This was supposed to be the moment that proved once and for all that he was nothing more than an impulsive businessman who had stumbled into power. But what she did not realize, what she had never even considered, was that Trump was not just a businessman. He was a strategist, a man who had spent his life negotiating high-stakes deals, navigating economic complexities, and outmaneuvering those who underestimated him. He was someone who had built an empire not by accident, but through an instinctive understanding of leadership, power, and human behavior. She had entered this challenge believing she was the superior intellect, but she had made one critical mistake. She had underestimated the very man she sought to humiliate. What happened next would not only shock her, but would send a ripple through the very institutions that had worked so hard to discredit him. The professor had walked into this debate expecting an easy victory. Instead, she was about to face something she had never encountered before. A leader who did not just know the facts, he knew how to use them to win. The professor had expected Donald Trump to struggle, to fumble through vague explanations, to expose himself as someone who had relied on others to handle the complexities of economic policy. She was certain that his understanding of the economy was limited to slogans and simplistic rhetoric, that when confronted with real analysis, he would falter. After all, she had spent years studying economic theories, analyzing data, and lecturing students on the intricacies of financial systems. In her mind, she was the expert, and he was the outsider who had stumbled into power without truly understanding the forces that shaped global markets. But what she had failed to consider was that Trump had spent his life mastering the very thing she had only studied in books. While she had built a career teaching others about economic principles, he had built a fortune applying them in the real world. He had navigated recessions, capitalized on market shifts, and negotiated deals with some of the most powerful financial players in the world. He understood economic policy not from the perspective of an observer, but from that of a participant, someone who had risked real money, faced real consequences, and emerged victorious time and time again. When he responded, it wasn't with abstract theories or ideological talking points. He spoke in hard facts, in numbers, in historical trends that exposed the weaknesses in her carefully constructed arguments. He pointed to policies that had failed time and time again, to nations that had collapsed under the weight of the very economic strategies she was defending. He explained why free markets outperformed centralized planning, why deregulation led to innovation, and why taxation policies that punished success ultimately harmed the very people they were meant to help. The professor had come prepared to lecture him on economic inequality, expecting him to struggle against the well-rehearsed narratives she had used for years to silence dissenting opinions. But instead, he countered with real-world examples, statistics that showed how economic freedom lifted people out of poverty, how businesses thrived when unshackled from excessive government interference, how the principles of capitalism had built the most prosperous nations in history. She had expected him to stumble when discussing trade, assuming that his America First stance was little more than a populist slogan with no real economic foundation. But he broke down the realities of trade imbalances, of unfair agreements that had crippled American industries, of how previous administrations had allowed foreign powers to take advantage of weak policies that prioritized global interests over national prosperity. He explained how negotiations worked not in theory, but in practice, how strength at the bargaining table led to better deals, how tariffs and trade leverage were tools that, when used correctly, protected national industries rather than harming them. She had believed that economic policy was something that only academics and career politicians could truly understand. But as he spoke, it became clear that he had a level of knowledge that was not just academic, but practical, honed through decades of real-world application. She had underestimated him, assuming that intelligence was measured by credentials and years spent in classrooms, failing to recognize that wisdom came from experience, from making decisions that carried real consequences. As he dismantled every one of her arguments, exposing the flaws in her perspective with precision and clarity, it became evident that this was not the moment she had envisioned. This was not the public humiliation of a so-called uninformed leader. This was something else entirely. It was a moment that revealed the stark difference between those who theorized about power and those who understood how to wield it. And as the conversation continued, it became clear that she was not the one in control. What she had expected to be an easy intellectual victory had turned into something far different. A realization that the man she had dismissed as an amateur was, in fact, a master of the very subject she had spent her life studying. But there was still more to come, because as the discussion shifted to history, she would soon learn that Trump's knowledge extended far beyond economics. And what happened next would shake the very foundation of her confidence. The professor had spent her entire career in the academic world, where theories and models were discussed in classrooms but rarely tested in real-world conditions. She had built her reputation on intellectual debates, on publishing papers that dissected economic principles, and on lectures that framed capitalism through a lens of skepticism. She believed that knowledge was something earned through academic study, through credentials, through peer-reviewed approval. But what she failed to understand was that true mastery of a subject was not found in the repetition of theories, but in the ability to apply them successfully in the real world. And that was where Donald Trump thrived. Trump had not learned about economics by reading case studies. He had lived them. He had not studied markets from a distance. He had shaped them. While the professor had spent years writing about economic policies, he had spent years building businesses, hiring workers, negotiating with some of the toughest financial minds in the world, and making decisions that carried real consequences. Every risk he took, every investment he made, every negotiation he entered was a direct test of his understanding of economics. And unlike those who merely theorized about wealth creation, he had proven time and time again that he knew how to generate it. When he spoke, it was not in vague, theoretical language. He did not hide behind complex jargon or appeal to abstract principles that had never been tested outside of academia. Instead, he broke down economic realities in a way that was clear, direct, and impossible to argue against. He spoke about the challenges of running a business, the weight of responsibility that came with making payroll, the impact of regulations that strangled entrepreneurship before it had a chance to grow. He explained how government intervention, no matter how well-intentioned, often crippled the very industries it claimed to protect, driving jobs overseas and burdening small businesses with costs they could not afford. He pointed out that while professors could discuss theories of wealth redistribution, it was people like him who actually created the wealth that made those discussions possible. He explained that while academics debated the effectiveness of economic policies, business leaders like him had to navigate them in real time, adapting to market shifts, policy changes, and global financial instability. He described the reality of economic downturns, not as numbers on a chart, but as moments where real people, real families and real businesses either survived or collapsed. For the professor's students, this was something they had never heard before. They had been taught to analyze economics through ideology, through frameworks that often ignored the unpredictable nature of human decision-making and market behavior. But here was a man who had actually experienced these forces firsthand, who understood not just the theory of economic survival, but the practice of it. Trump explained how every successful business decision he had made was a lesson in economics, how every failed venture had taught him more than any academic study ever could. He revealed how his instincts, developed through years of experience, had allowed him to anticipate market shifts, negotiate advantageous deals, and build an empire that had not just survived, but thrived. He spoke of leadership in terms that the professor had never considered, not as a skill that could be studied, but as something earned through action, through resilience, through the ability to make decisions that others were too afraid to make. The professor had thought that theory would triumph over experience. She believed that her years of study would be enough to prove her intellectual superiority. But what she had failed to understand was that while theory could be debated endlessly, experience could not be argued with. The facts of Trump's success, the reality of his achievements, and the depth of his understanding were undeniable. And as the discussion continued, it became clear that this was more than just a debate about economics. This was about the very nature of knowledge itself. Who truly understands the world, the one who studies it from a distance, or the one who builds it with his own hands? The professor was beginning to realize that she had walked into a battle she was not prepared for. But the biggest shock was yet to come, because Trump was about to take the discussion even further into a subject that she had always assumed was her greatest strength, history. And what happened next would leave her questioning everything she thought she knew. The professor, desperate to regain control of the debate, turned to a subject she believed would be her strongest weapon, history. If she could not expose Trump as uninformed in economics, surely she could prove that his understanding of America's past was shallow. After all, she had spent decades teaching history, dissecting past presidencies, and crafting detailed arguments about the evolution of American governance. She was certain that here, in this intellectual battleground, she would finally outmatch him. She began by drawing comparisons between Trump and past leaders, hoping to push him into a corner. She cited moments in history where populist figures had risen, only to be undone by their own arrogance or ignorance. She referenced presidents who had struggled with economic turmoil, legal battles, and political resistance, attempting to paint Trump as yet another leader destined for failure. She moved quickly into constitutional law, posing questions that she assumed would reveal gaps in his knowledge. Then she shifted to America's founding principles, prepared to expose what she believed was a contradiction between his leadership and the ideals upon which the nation was built. What she had not accounted for was the fact that Trump had spent years studying these very issues, not as an academic exercise, but as a roadmap for leadership. He did not respond with vague generalities or rehearsed sound bites. Instead, he dismantled her arguments with precise historical references, drawing direct lines between the policies of past leaders and the challenges facing modern America. He pointed to the founding fathers, not just as distant historical figures, but as visionaries who understood the dangers of government overreach. He spoke of their warnings against unchecked power, of their insistence that freedom could only be preserved through vigilance. He explained how their debates, their fears, and their principles were still relevant today, how their fight against tyranny was mirrored in the modern battle to preserve constitutional rights. When she attempted to frame his leadership as unprecedented, he countered with historical precedents. He spoke of presidents who had faced intense opposition from the media, who had been attacked by the political establishment, who had been ridiculed for challenging the status quo, yet had emerged victorious because they stood firm in their convictions. He reminded her that history was not shaped by those who played it safe, but by those who defied the expectations of their time. She then shifted to constitutional law, assuming she could expose him as ignorant of its complexities. But once again, he proved her wrong. He spoke with authority on the separation of powers, on the dangers of judicial activism, on the importance of originalist interpretations of the Constitution. He highlighted how modern liberal agendas often ignored or distorted the very document they claimed to defend, twisting its meaning to fit political narratives rather than respecting its true intent. When she attempted to argue that America had evolved beyond its founding principles, that modern governance required a departure from the original framework, he was quick to respond. He explained that the Constitution was designed not to adapt to political trends, but to protect the nation from them. He reminded her that the erosion of constitutional values had led to the very instability, division, and government overreach that she claimed to oppose. As he continued to speak, drawing on moments in history that she had never expected him to reference, it became clear that this was no ordinary debate. This was not the moment of humiliation she had anticipated. This was something far greater. She had walked into this discussion assuming she held the intellectual high ground, but now she found herself struggling to keep up. The students who had come expecting to see Trump outmatched were instead witnessing something they had never seen before, a leader who did not just understand history, but who could wield it as a weapon. A man who knew that the lessons of the past were not just for textbooks, but for guiding the future. And yet, the professor was not ready to concede defeat. If history could not break him, she would turn to another subject, one that had become the most controversial battleground of all. She would challenge him on the issue of socialism, convinced that here, finally, she could expose him as an extremist, as someone out of touch with modern economic realities. But once again, she was about to realize that she had underestimated him. And the next exchange would be the most devastating of all. Donald Trump's journey is filled with resilience, bold decisions, and unforgettable moments. Stay inspired. Like this video, drop a comment below, and subscribe to be part of this movement. The professor, like so many of her ideological peers, had spent years crafting the illusion that socialism was a misunderstood and unfairly maligned economic system. She had lectured halls filled with students, arguing that socialism, if properly implemented, could create a more just and equal society. To her, capitalism was an outdated system driven by greed, while government intervention was the key to progress. She believed that Donald Trump, a billionaire who had built his career on free market principles, would be unable to defend his position against her carefully rehearsed arguments. She was wrong. Trump did not hesitate. He had seen firsthand what socialism did to nations. He had studied not just the theories, but the real-world consequences. He didn't speak in hypotheticals as she did. He spoke in undeniable facts. He pointed to Venezuela, once one of the richest nations in Latin America, now reduced to economic ruin under socialist policies. He described how government control of industry had led to mass shortages, how price controls had destroyed businesses, and how the promises of equality had resulted in nothing but suffering. He reminded her of the Soviet Union, where socialism had not only failed, but had led to one of the most oppressive regimes in modern history. He spoke of Cuba, where government control had stifled innovation and opportunity, where citizens risked their lives on makeshift rafts just for the chance to escape to a free market economy. He cited examples from Eastern Europe, where socialist policies had impoverished entire populations until capitalism was reintroduced, allowing these nations to rebuild and thrive. She tried to counter, arguing that those examples were not true socialism, that they were simply the results of poor implementation. But Trump was ready for that. He pointed out how every single time socialism had been attempted, it had followed the same pattern: promises of equality, government seizure of industry, bureaucratic inefficiency, economic collapse, and ultimately, oppression. He exposed how the very nature of socialism required control, how it removed individual incentive and innovation, and how it always led to those in power consolidating wealth while the people suffered. Then he turned the conversation to America. He warned what would happen if the policies she defended were implemented on a larger scale. He explained how government overreach was already suffocating businesses, how excessive taxation stifled growth, and how socialist-leaning policies in certain cities had led to skyrocketing crime rates, failing economies, and a mass exodus of residents seeking better opportunities elsewhere. He asked why, if socialism was so successful, people were fleeing from socialist countries to capitalist ones, and never the other way around. He then contrasted the failures of socialism with the success of free market capitalism. He described how capitalism had lifted more people out of poverty than any other system in human history. He pointed to the explosion of technological innovation, the ability of individuals to rise based on their own talent and hard work, the rapid growth of industries that had improved life for millions. He explained how competition led to better products, better wages, and more opportunity, while government intervention always resulted in inefficiency, waste, and stagnation. The professor, who had entered this exchange so sure of her own superiority, now found herself in unfamiliar territory. Her usual talking points had been dismantled, not by theoretical counter-arguments, but by cold, hard reality. Trump had done more than just refute her claims. He had exposed the fundamental flaws in the ideology she had spent her life defending. The students who had listened to her lectures, who had absorbed her carefully framed arguments, were now hearing a different perspective, one rooted in experience rather than classroom theory. They had been told that capitalism was a system of exploitation, yet here was a man who had built businesses, created jobs, and understood the economy in ways that no academic ever could. But Trump wasn't finished, because while he had just shattered the illusion of socialism as an economic system, he was about to go even further. He would expose the deeper agenda behind its promotion, the deliberate effort to strip away American values, to weaken national identity, and to create a culture of dependence rather than self-reliance. And that revelation would change everything. Donald Trump had already dismantled the professor's arguments on economics and history, but now he shifted the discussion to a battleground that was just as critical: education. He understood that the root of the problem was not just in flawed policies or failed economic models, but in the very institutions that shaped the minds of future generations. The professor had spent years teaching within the confines of academia, a system that rewarded conformity to leftist ideology rather than independent thought. She had assumed she was debating a politician, but now she found herself facing a man who was about to expose one of the greatest threats to America's future: educational indoctrination. Trump did not approach the topic as an outsider unfamiliar with the issue. He had spent years observing how universities and public schools had been transformed from institutions of learning into breeding grounds for political activism. He had seen how students who entered college with open minds left as ideological foot soldiers, trained to regurgitate talking points rather than think critically. He had witnessed the way history was rewritten, how capitalism was demonized, and how patriotism was painted as a relic of an outdated past. And now he was going to challenge the professor on why this was happening. He asked why schools were failing to teach students the skills they needed to succeed in the real world. Why was financial literacy not a core requirement? Why were students graduating with massive debt but no practical understanding of how to build wealth? Why were they being trained to resent the very economic system that had given them the opportunities they took for granted? He pointed out that while countries like China were focusing on math, science, and technology, American universities were more concerned with identity politics and grievance studies. The professor, who had built her career within this system, tried to defend it. She argued that education was about more than just job training, that universities were meant to be places of intellectual exploration. But Trump was ready. He agreed that education should expand minds, but he asked why that expansion only seemed to go in one direction. Why were students being taught that America was an inherently oppressive nation? Why were conservative, speakers being silenced on campuses that claimed to value diversity of thought. Why were professors allowed to push political agendas without challenge, turning classrooms into platforms for ideological indoctrination rather than spaces for genuine debate? He pointed to the alarming trend of young Americans supporting socialism despite its historical failures. Was this a coincidence? Or was it the result of an education system that deliberately omitted the lessons of history? He questioned why. So many universities were quick to criticize capitalism while simultaneously relying on massive endowments, government funding, and corporate donations. If capitalism was so evil, why were these institutions benefiting from it? Then he turned to the failures of the public school system. He highlighted the fact that despite record spending, students in many parts of the country were graduating without basic reading and math skills. He asked why administrators were more focused on political activism than improving educational outcomes. He exposed how teachers' unions protected failing educators while preventing real reform, ensuring that generations of students were left unprepared for the workforce. He explained that the real purpose of education should not be to create political activists, but to empower individuals with knowledge, skills, and the ability to think for themselves. Yet, under the current system, students were being taught to resent success, to see themselves as victims rather than as capable individuals with limitless potential. He called out the hypocrisy of universities that charged exorbitant tuition while pretending to be advocates for equality. He questioned why professors like the one standing before him, who claimed to believe in fairness, were silent about the predatory nature of student loan debt, which burdened graduates while enriching the very institutions that claimed to care about their futures. The professor, once so sure of her position, now found herself unable to counter the facts. She had believed that her years of academic experience would give her the upper hand. But now she saw that her arguments were collapsing under the weight of reality. The students listening were beginning to question what they had been taught, realizing that the system they had trusted might not be as noble as they had been led to believe. But Trump was not finished. He had exposed the failures of education, but now he was about to reveal how the media played a critical role in maintaining these illusions. The battle over truth was not just happening in classrooms, it was happening on television screens, in newspapers, and across social media. And what he was about to say next would shake the very foundation of the professor's belief in the institutions she had always defended. The moment Donald Trump exposed the failures of the education system and dismantled the professor's arguments, the impact was immediate. The exchange spread like wildfire, reaching millions who had long suspected that institutions of learning were no longer focused on education, but on ideological control. People who had been dismissed as conspiracy theorists for questioning academic bias now had undeniable proof that the system was designed to silence certain perspectives while amplifying others. The video was shared across social media, and no matter how much the mainstream media tried to ignore it, the truth was out. But the media could not afford to let this moment stand unchallenged. They had spent years crafting a narrative that painted Trump as uninformed, as someone who lacked the intelligence to engage in complex discussions. This exchange had shattered that illusion. He had spoken with clarity, with facts, with historical and economic knowledge that even his harshest critics could not deny. Worse yet, he had done so against an academic, a figure who represented the very intellectual elite that the media held up as the arbiters of truth. If Trump had not just matched her, but utterly dismantled her arguments, what did that say about their years of reporting? In newsrooms across the country, journalists scrambled to contain the damage. Headlines were crafted carefully, designed to shift focus away from the substance of the debate and towards superficial distractions. Some outlets attempted to frame the moment as Trump attacking an educator, portraying the professor as a victim rather than someone who had walked into the exchange with full confidence that she would humiliate him. Others outright ignored the substance of what was said, focusing instead on their usual criticisms of his demeanor, his tone, anything but the fact that he had proven them wrong. Yet, no matter how much they twisted the story, the footage spoke for itself. People who watched the full exchange could see what had really happened. They saw a professor who had entered the debate sure of her superiority, only to be overwhelmed by a man who spoke not from theory, but from experience. They saw how she had relied on carefully rehearsed arguments, only to be countered by someone who had lived the realities of leadership, economics, and governance. They saw the way Trump methodically exposed the failures of the institutions she defended, leaving her with no choice but to retreat into vague academic rhetoric that no longer held any weight. As the media scrambled to discredit the moment, something remarkable happened. The more they tried to bury the story, the more people sought it out. It became clear that the mainstream media was no longer in control of the narrative. People had begun to recognize the patterns, to see how every time Trump defied expectations, the media's response was not to report honestly, but to obscure, distort, and silence. They had done it before, with the economy, with history, with foreign policy, and now with education. But now, the public was paying attention. The professor herself, once held in high regard within academic circles, found her credibility shaken. She had expected to walk away from the exchange with newfound prestige, a viral moment that reinforced her role as an intellectual authority. Instead, she had become an example of what happened when theory collided with reality. And while her colleagues rushed to defend her, calling Trump's approach aggressive and unfair, the damage had already been done. Those who had watched the exchange in full knew the truth. She had not been a victim of aggression, she had been a victim of her own arrogance. Yet this was only the beginning. The media had lost control of this story, but they were not ready to surrender. They had seen how one moment of truth could shatter their carefully constructed illusions, and they knew they had to act. If they could not erase what had happened, they would do the next best thing, shift the attention elsewhere, launch new attacks, and work harder than ever to convince the public that what they had seen was not reality, but an illusion. But what they did not understand was that something had changed. People were no longer blindly accepting the narratives fed to them. They were questioning, they were seeking truth for themselves, and they were beginning to realize that Trump was not the caricature they had been led to believe. The media had spent years trying to silence him, to diminish his influence, to frame him as a man unfit to lead. But with every attempt, they only made him stronger. And now, as the battle for truth escalated, the media was about to face something they had never encountered before, a public that no longer trusted them. And the next revelation, the next challenge, would prove just how deep that distrust had become. As the footage of Trump's debate with the professor spread, something remarkable began to happen. For years, countless students had sat in classrooms, absorbing narratives that framed Trump as an unqualified, impulsive, and dangerous figure. They had been told that he was a man of slogans, not substance, that his leadership was built on bravado rather than knowledge. Many had accepted these portrayals without question, trusting the educators, media figures, and intellectuals who presented themselves as the ultimate arbiters of truth. But now, faced with undeniable evidence, they began to question everything. For the first time, many students realized that the version of Trump they had been taught was not the full picture. He had been described as incapable of discussing policy, yet here he was, articulating economic principles, historical patterns, and constitutional law with precision and confidence. They had been told that he was anti-intellectual, yet he had just dismantled a professor who was considered an expert in her field. They had been conditioned to believe that he was a reckless businessman, but his ability to analyze and break down complex topics with real-world clarity suggested something else. Entirely wisdom earned through experience. The reactions varied. Some students were stunned, realizing that the criticisms they had so often repeated were based on carefully crafted distortions rather than objective reality. Others were defensive, unwilling to immediately abandon years of programming, but they could not shake the feeling that something was not adding up. They had watched their professor, someone they admired and respected, walk into the debate full of confidence, only to be completely outmatched. They had expected her to expose Trump's ignorance, but instead, she had been the one left searching for answers. Outside of the academic world, the impact was even greater. Americans who had long suspected that universities had become echo chambers saw their suspicions confirmed. Parents who had watched their children return from college, parroting anti-capitalist rhetoric, now had tangible proof of the ideological bias that had taken over the education system. Business leaders, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens who had built their own success through hard work and innovation saw in Trump's arguments a reflection of their own experiences. Proof that the free market, personal responsibility, and limited government were the pillars of prosperity, not the enemies of progress. Conversations began to shift. In online forums, on social media, and in private discussions, people started asking questions they had never dared to ask before. If Trump had been right about economics, was he right about other things as well? If the media had misrepresented his intelligence, what else had they misrepresented? If the education system had failed to present an honest and balanced discussion on these issues, what other truths had been withheld? Some who had dismissed Trump entirely now felt compelled to dig deeper. They began reading his policies rather than just headlines about them. They revisited past speeches, comparing his words to the way they had been framed by the media. They started to see the pattern, how time and time again his positions had been twisted, his successes ignored, his failures exaggerated. The moment with the professor had been more than just a debate. It had been a wake-up call. But perhaps the most significant shift was among young people. Many had grown up in a world where it was socially unacceptable to defend Trump, where questioning mainstream narratives was met with ridicule. Now, however, they saw that questioning those narratives was not only necessary, but inevitable. The professor had been one of the most qualified individuals to challenge Trump, yet she had lost. And if she, with all of her credentials and years of academic prestige, could not defeat him in open debate, what did that say about the validity of the arguments she had been teaching all along? Yet, the establishment was not going to allow this awakening to continue unchecked. If one debate could unravel years of carefully crafted misinformation, then the battle to suppress independent thought was about to intensify. The media had failed to contain the story, but they were not finished. The academic institutions had been exposed, but they would not surrender their control without a fight. What came next would not be an honest attempt to engage in further debate or self-reflection. It would be something far more ruthless, because now the opposition knew they were losing their grip on the narrative. And when an empire of deception is threatened by the truth, it does not simply retreat, it strikes back with everything it has. The professor had entered the debate with an air of absolute confidence, certain that she would dismantle Donald Trump with the ease of a scholar correcting a misinformed student. She had spent her career teaching economic models, political theories, and historical analyses, all carefully structured to fit the ideological framework that she believed was unassailable. She had no doubt that Trump, a man she had long considered to be intellectually inferior, would be unable to withstand the weight of her arguments. But as the exchange unfolded, something happened that she had not anticipated. One by one, the points she had crafted so carefully were met with counters that exposed their flaws, not through abstract theorizing, but through the hard reality of experience. She watched as Trump methodically broke down her claims, backing up his arguments not with academic jargon, but with undeniable evidence, real-world examples, economic data, historical precedents, and the kind of strategic thinking that only someone who had spent decades navigating power, business, and politics could possess. She had assumed that her knowledge, shaped in the classrooms of elite institutions, would be superior to that of a man who had built his empire outside the academic world. But the problem was that while she had studied the economy from textbooks, he had lived it. While she had written about leadership, he had led. While she had debated theories about capitalism and government control, he had played a key role in shaping policies that affected millions. She had assumed she would expose his ignorance, yet here she was, struggling to defend her own positions against someone who not only understood them better than she did, but had the results to prove it. Every great leader leaves a legacy. Be part of the conversation. Smash that like button, share your opinion in the comments, and make sure to subscribe for more powerful Trump insights. For the first time in her career, she found herself in a position she was not prepared for. She had no counter-arguments that could withstand the scrutiny of reality. Her usual strategy of deflecting with theory and complex terminology was useless because Trump wasn't playing that game. He didn't need to reference academic theories when he could reference history. He didn't need to speak in vague hypotheticals when he could point to real, tangible outcomes. And worst of all for her, he wasn't just making points, he was making people think. She could feel the weight of the moment, the shift in the room. The students who had once hung on to her every word now looked at her differently. There was no longer the same blind trust, no automatic acceptance of her authority. Instead, there were questions. Questions she had no good answers for. She had walked into this debate expecting to humiliate Trump, expecting to emerge as the intellectual superior, the respected educator who had exposed a powerful figure as a fraud. Instead, she now stood exposed, not as a fraud herself, but as something far worse in the eyes of those who had believed in her unquestioningly. She was revealed as someone who had been wrong, and for someone who had built a career on certainty, on absolute confidence in her own worldview, that realization was devastating. Would she ever admit it publicly? That was another question entirely. To do so would mean not only acknowledging that she had been wrong about Trump, but that she had misled countless students over the years. It would mean questioning everything she had built her reputation on. And for many in her position, that was simply too much to bear. But those who had witnessed the exchange knew the truth. They had seen her hesitation, her frustration, the rare moments of silence where she had no response. They had seen how, despite her efforts to maintain composure, the cracks in her arguments had been revealed, and most importantly, they had seen Trump do something that no one had expected. He had not only defended himself against the intellectual elite, but had completely dismantled their authority in the process. Yet, the most powerful effect of this moment was not on the professor or even on Trump himself. It was on the people who had watched, those who had spent years being told one version of the truth, only to realize that they had never been given the full picture. They had seen firsthand what happened when the ideas they had been taught were put to the test against someone who was not bound by academic filters or ideological constraints. And now, the establishment had a problem, because the illusion had been shattered. And once people start to question, once they begin to think for themselves, once they realize that the experts they had trusted might not be as infallible as they seemed, there is no going back. The professor had lost more than an argument that day. She had lost control of the narrative, and for those who had spent decades shaping the public's perception of Trump, that loss was far more dangerous than any single debate. Because if one intellectual authority figure could be exposed, how many others would follow? And if people were starting to see the truth about Trump, what other truths might they begin to uncover? This moment was never just about a single debate. It was not about a professor challenging a political leader or about a businessman proving his intellectual depth. It was about something far greater, a shift in perception, a moment of reckoning for an entire system that had long operated under the assumption that authority was dictated by credentials rather than competence. It was about exposing a truth that had been buried for decades, that many of the so-called intellectual elites, the academics, the theorists, and the self-proclaimed experts wielded their knowledge not as a tool for enlightenment, but as a weapon of control. For years, these institutions had defined intelligence by narrow standards, degrees, publications, and adherence to prevailing academic theories. They had convinced the public that knowledge was something reserved for those within their circles, that understanding the world required years of study under their tutelage, that wisdom could only be granted by the approval of academia. But what this moment revealed, and what Trump had demonstrated with undeniable clarity, was that real intelligence was not found in memorizing theories, but in the ability to apply wisdom to the real world. Trump had not spent his life in lecture halls debating hypotheticals. He had built, negotiated, adapted, and thrived in a world where failure had real consequences. While the professor had studied economic models, he had tested them. While she had written papers on political leadership, he had led. While she had dismissed capitalism as an abstract system to be critiqued, he had used it to create jobs, generate wealth, and maneuver through global markets. He understood these subjects not because he had read about them, but because he had lived them. And that was what truly set him apart. The professor's downfall was not that she lacked knowledge. She had spent years accumulating information, studying historical events, mastering the language of academia. But what she lacked was wisdom, the ability to take that knowledge and apply it in ways that produced results. She had relied on arrogance, on the assumption that intelligence was measured by how well one could articulate a theory rather than how well one could make it work in reality. Trump had exposed that fallacy, proving that the real test of intellect was not found in debate clubs or academic conferences, but in the ability to succeed where others failed, to navigate complexity not through abstractions, but through decisive action. This moment mattered because it was a warning to those who had built their authority on illusion. It showed that the era where people blindly accepted the words of experts without question was coming to an end. People were waking up to the reality that experience, instinct, and common sense often outweighed academic posturing. It revealed that the system that had long dictated what was true and what was false, what was credible and what was not, was losing its grip. The impact of this realization extended far beyond the walls of any classroom. It sent shockwaves through every institution that had relied on the blind trust of the people: mainstream media, bureaucratic elites, career politicians, global organizations that operated under the assumption that their authority would never be challenged. If a single professor, armed with years of study and institutional backing, could be so easily dismantled by a man they had ridiculed as an uneducated populist, what did that say about the credibility of the entire system? But even as this revelation spread, the establishment was not ready to surrender. They knew that this moment, if left unchecked, could unravel everything they had built. If people began questioning the wisdom of intellectual elites, they might start questioning other things: the policies that had shaped their lives, the narratives that had been fed to them for years, the power structures that had dictated what they should believe. Trump had done more than just win a debate. He had planted a seed of doubt, a moment of clarity that could not be undone. And now the battle was no longer just about him. It was about whether people would continue to accept the narratives they had been given, or whether they would start looking beyond them, questioning everything they had once believed to be true. The elites had relied on illusion, but illusions only last as long as people are willing to believe them. And if this moment was any indication, belief in their authority was beginning to crumble. The question now was not whether Trump had exposed them, but whether the people would have the courage to act on what they had seen. Because once the truth is revealed, the real fight begins. Donald Trump's ability to dismantle the narratives of the so-called intellectual elite was never just about proving a point. It was about exposing a deeper truth. Time and time again, he had been dismissed, underestimated, and ridiculed by those who considered themselves the gatekeepers of knowledge. They mocked his lack of political experience, his rejection of academic norms, his refusal to conform to the expectations set by an establishment that had long prided itself on its exclusivity. Yet with each challenge, with each attempt to discredit him, he emerged stronger. He did not rely on carefully crafted theories or rehearsed speeches. He relied on instinct, on experience, on an understanding of human nature and power that no classroom could teach. This debate with the professor was not an isolated moment. It was a reflection of a pattern that had followed him since the day he stepped onto the political stage. Every time the media declared that he had made a fatal mistake, he proved them wrong. Every time political analysts predicted his downfall, he found a way to rise. Every time an expert claimed that he lacked the intellect to compete with the ruling class, he outmaneuvered them with ease. The professor had merely become the latest in a long line of individuals who had mistaken credentials for wisdom, who had assumed that their titles and academic accolades granted them superiority, only to be blindsided by the raw force of someone who understood how the world truly worked. The impact of this moment was not confined to the walls of that debate. It spread across the country, reaching millions who had spent years questioning why their concerns were ignored by those in power, why their voices were dismissed by intellectuals who had never stepped outside their academic bubbles. It validated the instincts of those who had felt that something was wrong with the way knowledge was being controlled and distributed. It gave confidence to those who had been afraid to challenge authority, to speak up against the narratives that had been imposed upon them. It reinforced what many had long suspected, that intelligence was not determined by where someone had studied, but by what they had accomplished, by what they had endured, by how they had applied their knowledge in the real world. But this was only one battle in a much larger war. The forces that sought to control thought, to dictate acceptable discourse, to define intelligence in a way that excluded those who refused to conform, were not going to back down. If anything, they would double their efforts, determined to suppress the awakening that moments like this created. They could not afford to allow people to see that the emperor had no clothes. They needed to regain control of the narrative before it slipped beyond their reach. The real question was no longer whether Trump could continue to expose these falsehoods. He had already proven that he could, over and over again. The question was whether those who had witnessed this moment, those who had felt the shift in perspective, would take the next step. Would they allow this moment to pass as just another political spectacle? Or would they recognize it for what it truly was? An invitation to question, to challenge, to reclaim their right to independent thought. Because this was never just about Trump. It was about every person who had ever been told that they were not qualified to have an opinion because they lacked the proper education, that their experiences were irrelevant compared to the theories of experts, that their instincts could not be trusted. It was about breaking free from the intellectual elitism that had long controlled society's perception of intelligence and truth. Now, the challenge was clear. Would those who had seen the truth in this moment be willing to stand up against the forces that sought to suppress it? Would they share this story, discuss it, and force those in power to acknowledge what had been revealed? Or would they allow the narrative to be rewritten once again, buried under a flood of carefully crafted distractions? This was only the beginning, and the next move belonged to those who had witnessed the truth unfold before their eyes. Strength, strategy, and vision. If these qualities inspire you, you're in the right place. Show your support by liking this video, commenting your thoughts, and subscribing for more.